There we go. And so this will be recorded, and you will be able to find the recording on our CPS HR website later today. Before we begin, we kindly request that you please remain on mute throughout the presentation. Should you have a question during the presentation, you may type it into the chat box and we will address it at the end of the session, or during, we might be able to get to it during the session too. So without further ado, Jeff, the virtual floor is yours.
Wow, the virtual floor. Excellent. Thank you. There's still some people coming in, but we'll go ahead and jump into it. This is so, the topic is, as Alan said, something in the testing and selection area, and I want to focus kind of narrowly about minimum qualifications. Let's think about minimum qualifications for a second here. We all know what minimum qualifications are. We're all familiar with developing them and using them as part of our screening process. And of course, minimum qualifications are those minimum amounts of certain types of education or experience that an applicant has to have in order to be considered minimally qualified enough to move on into the selection process. And so they're really those statements of usually education and experience that indicate that an applicant is at least minimally qualified for a particular job, right? That's what our minimum qualifications are. At least we hope so. But ultimately, how do we know that? How do we know that that's what they actually are and that's what they're doing? What do our minimum qualifications really tell us about an applicant? Well, as you probably know, minimum qualifications have been historically problematic. They can be ineffective at actually reducing our candidate pools in a meaningful way. They can, the worst part is they can screen out qualified applicants, or applicants who are otherwise qualified, but because they don't have a certain degree or certain specific types of experience, we'll screen them out. And then, of course, we're eliminating, possibly some good candidates from the process, or we can also be discriminating against people. That can cause disparate impact, adverse impact, and discrimination. And there have been decades, decades and decades of lawsuits based on minimum qualifications. So it's really, really important that we make sure that our minimum qualifications are valid, so they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, that they're job related, and I'm going to use the term job related quite a bit today. And of course, job related means content valid, meaning the content of our selection process, in this case, the minimum qualifications, is directly related to the performance of the job. So we're only requiring something that is needed for performing the job. So that's job related, and that they're fair and that they're defensible. Well, how do we do that? How do we make sure of that? And I would argue that we have been thinking about minimum qualifications wrong, basically. We need to think about them a little bit differently in order to make sure that they are valid and they're fair and they're defensible and all of that. So that's what I want to talk about today for about the next 45 or 50 minutes or so. So as Alan said, I am Jeff Burkhan. I'm one of the senior consultants here at CPS HR Consulting. And for the past, about 16 years just here at CPS, I've been involved in job analysis and exam development, developing selection procedures, helping our clients with their minimum qualifications and their job descriptions, and developing competency models and things like that. And these issues with the minimum qualifications, it's something that has come up over my 16 years here, and then many years even before that, working in HR. The biggest thing that I hear is that minimum qualifications aren't part of the selection process. They're not really a selection test like different parts of the process are. And so it doesn't really matter. The whole concept of them being valid and job related doesn't really matter quite so much. Well, so I'm going to talk about minimum qualifications just kind of generally. I'm going to assume that we all really know what they are, because I really want to get into thinking about them a little bit differently. So I'm going to talk about how we use them and where they are in the process typically, how we typically develop minimum qualifications or where they come from, some of the problems that can solve or cause, um, how we need to be thinking about minimum qualifications then in order to be able to develop ones that are fair and valid and defensible and all of that. I'm also going to touch a little bit on preferred or desirable qualifications, because that's a typically thought of as part of that minimum qualification screen, sort of that looking for the above and beyond people. But that can be particularly problematic if those aren't valid and job related. So I'm going to try to cover all of this stuff. And I'll warn you right now, this may be a little bit of a rant. I may do some ranting, because this is based on something I think is kind of frustrating, that I've seen again over the years working with our clients, kind of overlooking the minimum qualifications, or not considering them to be such an important part of that whole selection process. So let's think about the hiring process. A basic hiring process looks kind of like this. You start with your recruitment activities. You advertise for the position. You put together a job announcement. Then you've got a minimum qualification screen, which generally your minimum qualifications are going to be based on your job description or your class specification, if you're in the public sector. And what's kind of the there's usually some established minimum qualifications that we're going to use. So you put those all into the exam announcement, and you put the exam announcement out there. And then meanwhile, you're going to have some kind of a selection process after that, whether it's an interview or some kind of testing process. And then you're going to select your finalist, and then the hiring. So that's the basic hiring process. And also, when I say selection process, that's anything that goes into the what you would call testing. Could be additional screening, like a supplemental application questionnaire, formal testing of any kind, paper and pencil testing. It could be interviews, work sample tests, assessment centers, and then the so-called final interviews or fit interviews, hiring interviews, all of that stuff. That's when I talk about the selection process, I mean all of those various different things. Well, if you look at the hiring process, there's sort of this line between the minimum qualification screen and the selection process. And it's this line that separates our applicants from the candidates. An applicant is someone who has expressed interest in a position, usually by submitting an application or sending in a resume or something. Then we have our minimum qualification screen, and so to determine who is going to go on into the selection process. Once we have decided that an applicant is minimally qualified and they can go into the selection process, they become a candidate. So again, that minimum qualification screen is the process for determining who becomes a candidate from our group of applicants. Now, the minimum qualification screen is a really important part of the process. Now, first of all, there are a lot of minimum qualifications that we use and we have to use for legal reasons. There are certain licenses or certifications that are required for a particular kind of job. I'm not talking about those, because we don't have any say in those. That's just based on legal requirements. So when I'm talking about minimum qualifications, these are those types of experience and education that we want to apply to basically, in most cases, it's really to reduce a large applicant pool down to a manageable candidate pool. So, you've probably had situations or seen situations where you've got 200 applicants. You can only interview, say, 20 people, and you've got one open position. So you've got to reduce that applicant pool in a meaningful way to get to that final candidate pool. And by meaningful way, I mean based on something related to the job, something that is required for the job, so some kind of related, education or experience. But again, a very important part of the process. Yeah, and you can also think of this line between the minimum qualification screen and the selection process really as dividing our hiring process into two phases, essentially. There's a recruitment phase with all of those recruitment activities and advertising the position and everything, and then screening the applications, which means applying our minimum qualification screen. And then there's that whole selection phase where we take all of our applicants who are now candidates, and then we have some kind of testing process and then hiring after that. Well, I think it's thinking about our hiring process in these two phases and putting that minimum qualification screen within that recruitment phase and thinking of it as existing only there, I think that has been part of our problem. So let's look at minimum qualifications. Let me ask you, or think about this. Where do your minimum qualifications come from? So the ones that you apply, when you are hiring, when you're creating a job announcement, where do they come from? Well, I can tell you where they typically come from, and this is based on my years of experience in the public sector working with lots and lots of different clients. So see if this sounds familiar to you. Um, so you have an opening, you need to fill a position. So the first thing you're going to do probably is you need to announce that. You need to announce the job, announce the testing process. So you're going to create a job announcement. And usually to do that, you're going to pull the job description or class specifications, whatever documentation you have on the job, and it's usually going to have like the definition of the job and some general descriptions. So you take some information from that. It's going to have a list of the, duties or essential functions, and it's going to have a whole bunch of other information. And of course, it's going to have minimum qualifications. Usually those are kind of written into the job description, some established minimum qualifications for the job. And you're going to take those, use those, in your minimum qualification screen. So that's all good. You put together your job announcement, you put it out there, and so meanwhile, while the application process is open, you start working on your selection process, figuring out how, once you get a group of candidates, how you're going to select the best of those candidates for the job. So hopefully you've done some kind of a job analysis. Hopefully you're familiar with job analysis. Of course, job analysis, I'll talk about it a few times today, is it's a systematic way of studying a job to identify all the critical tasks that are performed on the job, and then identifying the competencies or the KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities that are required for performing those particular job tasks, so that you know what to test for, what to be looking for in an assessment process, and that way it's completely job related and valid and all of that. So you'll do some kind of review of the job, even if it's sitting down with some subject matter experts and talking about what it is it takes to be successful in the job, what kind of person we're going to be looking for, et cetera. And then you figure out how you're going to go about testing for that. So you come up with an exam plan, and then you're going to work on developing your selection tools. Maybe it's just putting together an interview. Maybe you're going to do a training and experience questionnaire. Maybe you're going to do a work sample test. Whatever it is, you're working on that. So it's all good. Your process is well underway. So what's the problem? So it seems fine, right? Um, you know, if you're working on your selection process the way I'm talking about it, by reviewing, job analysis information or some kind of review of the job, looking at those critical KSAs or competencies, um, so your selection process is likely to be job related. Remember, job related, I'm talking about, it's about validity. It's about assessing only what is required for performing the job. So your process, whatever it is, your selection tool is looking for only those critical requirements for the job. So that's what I mean by job related, also known as content validity, meaning the content of your selection process or tool matches the content of the job. Very, very important. And you're going to have that if you develop your process based on this, right? So it's all good. But what about your minimum qualifications though? how do you ensure that they're going to be valid and defensible and job related and all of that if they weren't part of that reviewing the job analysis data and all of that? Um, So typically, the minimum qualification screen is not thought of as part of the selection process. It's considered that one of those initial steps in the recruitment phase of the job, putting together the job announcement, getting it out there. It's just thought of as a way to, just part of our application screen. They're not candidates yet, so we're just figuring out who we want to let in. So there's almost sometimes it's either overlooked or there's not as just as much care. And so they're very often not based on a review of the job, whether it's formal job analysis results or they're even current. How many of you have job descriptions that have minimum qualifications in them that go back 10 years or 15 years or whatever, and they're just really not revised very often? I think a lot of us, I think that's extremely common. And the minimum qualifications could be old, they could be generally incorrect. And, jobs change a lot over time. And so what worked 10 years ago doesn't necessarily work now. But a really big problem with minimum qualifications, the existing ones, is that they're often based on assumptions about the job and assumptions about what it would take to be successful on the job, at least at a minimum level. So let me give you an example. Let's say we have a position that's an IT help desk position. All right. And we know it's a journey level position. So, so it's a highly technical job. You have to have a lot of knowledge about computers. Journey level, we need someone who can just come in and just start day one, start doing the job basically. So it sounds like a bachelor's degree in computer science. It sounds like that would be a good assumption. I think we should require a bachelor's degree in computer science just to make sure that everyone's got that base knowledge, and for this fairly high level job. And then we want some experience. We want people who can come in and just start doing the job right away. That takes probably about, general experience with hiring people. It takes about 2 years or so for people to fully get up to speed and to have been through, the job long enough to have seen all the various different aspects of the job. So we'll just assume bachelor's degree in computer science and 2 years performing help desk duties. But now look at this though. But why? I mean, you have to look at your requirements and ask why. Why are we really requiring these? And remember, you have to be able to demonstrate the job relatedness of this. We have to be able to say that because without a bachelor's degree, someone would not be able to do this job. And without 2 years of this very specific experience, someone would not be able to do the job. And if you can't say that absolutely about your minimum qualifications, you really have no business requiring those of your applicants. It's not fair. And remember, one of the biggest problems is we could be eliminating people who are otherwise qualified. Maybe someone doesn't have a bachelor's degree in computer science, but for whatever reason, they would be successful in the job. I want to talk just very briefly, and I promise you it's brief because nobody likes to talk about the uniform guidelines. But if you go all the way back to the federal uniform guidelines on employee selection procedures, and if you're not familiar with them, this was way back in 1978. A whole bunch of the federal enforcement agencies, that is, the agencies that enforce the civil rights laws related to hiring, like so Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, among many others. They got together and they created this document to tell employers basically what they need to do to make sure that their selection procedures are valid. And so that became the foundation for our validation processes, doing job analysis and developing our selection tests based on job analysis results and all that kind of stuff. I won't go into the uniform guidelines more than that, except to say that it says right in these uniform guidelines that a selection procedure includes physical education and experience requirements. So that would be minimum qualifications. So this document, going all the way back, um, is saying that minimum qualifications, or that minimum qualification screen, is a selection procedure. And it also says later in the document somewhere, the procedures by which persons are identified as candidates is a selection procedure. And so remember, our hiring process and that line between the two phases, and how our minimum qualification screen is how we determine who goes from applicant to candidate. So again, more evidence that our minimum qualification screen is a selection procedure. And why is that important? Well, because all selection procedures have to be valid and job related, and in the public sector have to be merit based, meaning we're only selecting people based on their ability or predicted ability to perform the job and nothing else. So very, very important to think of our minimum qualification screen where it actually is in the process. Now, the actual process is like this. You've got your recruitment activities, you bring in your applications, you're screening them based on your minimum qualification screen, then you move on to the selection process. But, you know, remember how I was saying that that's kind of problematic, thinking of the minimum qualifications as not part of the selection process. So really, we need to think of them as here. Now, that's not where it actually happens in the process, but for development purposes, we need to think of our minimum qualifications as part of that overall selection program, really, that includes all that other stuff: additional screening, formal testing, interviews, the final hiring or fit interviews, all of that other stuff. We need to think about the minimum qualification screen as being part of that. It's just a first step, but think of that as part of it. And that's not where it really happens in the process, but we need to get in the mindset of it being a selection tool, the selection tool that it is, which means that you develop your minimum qualifications, or you should, the way that you would develop any other selection tool. And of course, as we all know, that's through starting with some kind of a job analysis. I talked a little bit about that before. I won't go into great detail about job analysis, but at a minimum, in a job analysis, which is and job analysis isn't, there's some misconceptions about job analysis. And job analysis is not just looking at the job description and figuring out what KSAs are listed on the job description and then testing for those. Job analysis is the process used to create a job description that is complete and it's accurate and it's up to date. And so, as most of you probably know, a job analysis involves identifying the critical tasks that are performed on the job, and then identifying what the specific knowledge, skills, and abilities are needed for performing those particular job tasks. Then a very important part of the job analysis is identifying which of those knowledge, skills, and abilities, or KSAs, are needed upon hire versus learned on the job. There are a lot of knowledge, skills, and abilities that are needed for performing the job or enable better job performance, but they're not necessarily needed day one on the job. But you learn them either in formal training or just kind of overtime on the job. So our job analysis is going to identify all of this. And here's the key thing, though, for using the job analysis in developing our minimum qualifications. You want to have subject matter experts help you identify the types and amounts of education and training experience, all of that stuff, that would demonstrate likely possession of those KSAs at the minimum level. And let me say, this is the first time I mentioned this, but I'll say it again later. You need to be working with subject matter experts when you do this, because the experts in the job are the ones who are going to be able to tell you the kinds of training and the kinds of experience that would really give someone those particular KSAs. So let me give you an example of how this would work in a very basic in a basic way. So let's say we have a position of or job or classification of finance analyst, and we did our job analysis, and there's a whole bunch of KSAs that we've identified. And this is an abbreviated list, but we could think of this as maybe the top the top 5 critical KSAs. Let's say we have knowledge of business statistics, knowledge of state and federal tax laws, knowledge of financial modeling practices, and a couple of skills, skill to analyze financial statements, skill to review expenditures for budgets and that kind of stuff. So let's think about how that would translate then to education. Remember, we're trying to identify what would indicate the minimum level of those. This is what you don't want to do. You don't want to just look at the job and think, okay, this is a high level position in the finance department, requires a lot of knowledge at a high level. Therefore, a finance degree makes sense. It seems simplistic, but I do see this a lot in various agencies. They'll just look at a job and they think, okay, it's highly technical. It's a professional job. Professional meaning it typically requires some kind of preparation, formal preparation to be able to do that job. Um, and so therefore, a degree in finance just kind of makes sense. And I see this a lot, but that's not the way to go about it. And I'll tell you why in a second. This is what your thought process should be to arrive at the same place, but in a different way. You should say the knowledge required to perform the job would only be acquired through formal education. And you might decide that, or your subject matter experts would help you decide that a degree in finance, that would indicate likely possession of the critical knowledge, at least at the minimum level. So then you can require a degree in finance. And I know maybe you're thinking, I don't know what you're thinking, but maybe you're thinking, that's the same thing. We've come to the same conclusion that they have to have a finance degree. What's the difference? The difference is in your process. The first one at the top is not defensible. That's not job related, not defensible, not valid. The one on the bottom is valid. It is defensible. And when I say valid, there are some misconceptions about validity. People ask all the time with our CPS tests, for example. They say, "Is it valid? Is it a valid test?" And there's no such thing as valid or invalid. Validity is not a quality that's inherent in the test itself. Validity, to be valid, is to have demonstrated the validity of the test or the process through how it was developed, how it's applied, how you interpret the results. So if you develop your minimum qualifications through the bottom approach, you have demonstrated validity, the content validity of it, because you have looked at those knowledges from your job analysis and you've decided that they could only have been acquired through basically through a degree in finance. So even though it's the same, you've arrived at the same place, um, again, your approach shows the validity of it. But also note that with the top, if we just assume finance degree, that's it, we're going to require that. Anyone who doesn't have a finance degree is not going to get through. The bottom one saying a degree in finance would indicate likely possession, but it leaves it open to say something else might. We're going to go and look. When we look at our equivalencies, we're going to go and look at other things that might indicate possession of those critical KSAs, because we're not just assuming that a particular degree is, appropriate. When we're looking at experience, it's the same kind of thing. We don't want to just make assumptions. Now, I see this all the time where there's too much of a focus on the tasks or the duties of the job itself. For example, if one of the critical tasks of this job is to analyze financial statements, the thought would be, well, we need someone who can analyze financial statements. Therefore, we should require a certain amount of experience analyzing financial statements. I know that seems simplistic, but I see this a lot where there's just a focus on, too much of a focus just directly on the job. What do people have to do? Therefore, we want people who have done that without thinking about there are maybe other ways and maybe lots of other ways where people would be able to do the job. So you want to think, what would it take to be able to do that particular task? Don't think we just need people who can do the task, but what does it actually take? What goes into that particular task? And what what would it take for someone who maybe didn't have that experience, but they could actually do it? What other things would they have? And again, you're going to use your subject matter experts, but it could be things like knowledge of financial reporting principles, and then maybe if they had experience analyzing large sets of numerical data. If they had that, maybe they would be able to perform that particular task. Remember, we're looking for the minimum level, just an absolute minimum cutoff. We would want people who have experience analyzing financial statements. They're probably going to be the better employee. They're probably going to be the people we ultimately want to hire. But remember, we want to be able to screen out not qualified people, but make sure that people get through who would be qualified. Maybe they don't have that specific experience, but they've done other things that would enable them to do that particular task at a minimum level. Because a lot of things enable task performance. And one of them is knowledge. There's procedural knowledge. If you know how to do something, even if you've never done it, you might be able to do it by applying the knowledge. Or there's also skill transfer, which is where if you've done something that's very, very similar, you may be able to do something that you haven't done before because you've done that other thing. And especially if you put the two of those together, you've got some kind of procedural knowledge and the skill transfer, you've done something similar, you may be able to do that thing. So this could be, a minimum qualification. If we wanted, say, experience analyzing large sets of numerical data, and then along with the education where they're going to have knowledge of financial reporting principles, they're likely to be able to analyze financial statements, at least at a minimum level. And just one other warning about focusing too much on the duties or the tasks of the job. And it's kind of an unusual situation, but it is something to consider. If you are requiring experience in something that is an essential function of the job, which means that if it's an essential function, it's possible that someone could get um, an accommodation for that, and they wouldn't have to do that necessarily. But if you're requiring experience doing that particular thing, maybe they had an accommodation before, and you screen them out, that's discrimination based on ADA. Again, I think it's probably a rare situation, but it's entirely possible. And something like analyzing financial statements, it probably wouldn't be that, but you have to think about what could be accommodated in the workplace and don't require experience doing anything that could potentially be accommodated. So just another reason why you don't want to just focus too much directly on the tasks, but on the KSAs required to perform the tasks. Now, as you probably know, from developing minimum qualifications, the hardest part is identifying that right level. So you've decided that they need a degree, or your subject matter experts have said that you could only get the knowledge, at a sufficient level through formal education. Okay, so now we need to figure out what it is. But another mistake people make is looking at the job itself, thinking about the level of the job, and then what's an appropriate corresponding level of education. Highly technical, journey level job, probably a bachelor's degree. That's that assumption that I was talking about. Is that really appropriate? I mean, maybe we want people who have a bachelor's degree level of knowledge, but remember our minimum, just for the minimum, what would give someone the absolute minimum? So don't look at the whole job and think about what's the appropriate level, but think about how much education would it take to have acquired those knowledges at the minimum level. And then you go back to your job analysis, look at your critical knowledges. So don't focus on the job itself, but look at those knowledges. Look at what would it take? Business statistics, state and federal tax laws, financial modeling practices. Let's say our subject matter experts determine that, you'd probably have to have, at least like an associate's degree, as long as it included classwork in those particular things, right? So you have to also identify what, if it's like a certificate program, what certificates specifically, it's, what specific courses. Don't just assume that, a degree in finance is going to include or would have included the information, that you're looking for, based on your knowledges. So you have to specify. So you might, we might end up with, let's see, an associate's degree in finance. So that'd be the minimum. We might prefer a bachelor's degree. I'll talk about preferred qualifications in a little bit, but at a minimum, associate's degree in finance, accounting, or related field. Need to figure out what would be related. But with coursework in business statistics, law, and financial modeling. So you've seen that before. That's very familiar, where you're actually specifying what is included. And that's a great thing. And you need to do that. So again, don't make assumptions about what is in a particular degree program at some school that you don't know about. And then identifying the right amount of experience. Of course, that's difficult too. So you want to think about how much experience would indicate the minimum level of that particular knowledge or skill. Remember, don't focus directly on the duties or essential functions of the job and think about, how much experience do we want people to have doing that stuff, because remember, they might be able to do those things with different kinds of experience. So if you focus on the KSAs, you're much likely to, you're much more likely to uh, to be accurate, basically, to make sure that your minimum qualifications are going to be doing what they want and not screening out people who are otherwise qualified. So let's say it's, experience analyzing large sets of numerical data. Remember, we decided that that they don't need to have, say, experience analyzing, reviewing financial documents, but if they've analyzed large sets of numerical data, we might decide that is, that would be, sufficient. So you want to identify, again, the level of, how much experience would it take to have developed that, the knowledge. Remember, they're going to transfer that, that skill and knowledge to that other thing. So how much experience would it take? And just keep in mind, we're looking for the minimum level. When you're working with subject matter experts, and you've probably seen this, they will very often say, 2 years of that, is probably good, but no, we really want 3. We should really want people with 3 years, so make it 3 years. And you have to remind them, we're looking for that absolute minimum. We're not likely going to be hiring the person who only has the 2 years, but we want to talk to them. We want to bring them into the process because they may be qualified. And remember, keep in mind, more isn't necessarily better. It's not like 2 years and like 3 years, they would have gained more, maybe so, but not necessarily with experience. There are a lot of jobs where if you've done certain activities on the job for a year or so, you're not necessarily going to get better at them. Sometimes you will, but not necessarily. So be thinking about that. But let's say we decided that, it's 3 years. You have to make sure you specify, what context, is it like in a finance department? Does it have to be in the public sector? And make sure, if you're going to require that, make sure it's for a good reason, that it matters. So to sum all that up, our finance analyst KSAs, these are our, let's say, our top 5 critical ones, and we would end up with, associate's degree in finance, accounting, or related field with coursework in those various different things, and 3 years experience analyzing large sets of numerical data in a public sector finance or accounting department. So it looks familiar, probably looks like minimum qualifications that you've seen, but this one is job related, you can demonstrate the validity of it. You can say that it is based on the KSAs, based on our job analysis, the KSAs that are required for the job that are important and needed upon entry. And so while you might end up with pretty much the same thing, now you're able to show that it's valid. And you've also taken care to make sure that you're not going to be eliminating people who are actually qualified, but maybe don't look like it based on the typical assumptions about what minimum qualification should be. So I want to talk just briefly about equivalencies. So these are those ways that people can essentially make up for not having a particular degree or particular kind of experience. So don't, another common a common thing to do is to look at an associate's degree and to think, okay, if someone doesn't have an associate's degree, what could they have to make up for it? And you think about an associate's degree and you think about what is roughly equal to an associate's degree, but that's the wrong way to go about it because that's just too abstract, trying to figure out what's related to an associate's degree. You need to go back to your KSAs and think about what would demonstrate those KSAs at that same level, at the level of an associate's degree. And then would it be, say, more coursework or certifications or other specific experience? Now actually, if someone had done this kind of work, they would have acquired those same ones. I think using that approach where you're going back to the KSAs and you're thinking about other ways that someone could demonstrate possession of those KSAs, I think you're more likely to come up with other valid qualifications. Whereas if you just focus on the degree, you might think, well, there's really nothing equivalent to an associate's degree, except maybe they were working toward a degree and they have an equal number of course credits or something like that. But then you're kind of confining yourself to degrees and talking about degrees, whereas you need to kind of get creative sometimes and think about all sorts of other ways that someone could demonstrate that education or experience. If we're requiring 3 years experience doing this particular thing, think of what other kinds of experience would demonstrate possession of the KSAs, not what is equal to 3 years of analyzing data, but go back to our KSAs and think about what other types of experience. It's just a better way of looking at it, where I think you're going to be able to come up with more ideas about how someone could demonstrate that. Maybe it's more education. So rather than looking at 3 years of doing this, but if they had 3 years of doing something else, that might be equal. If you get out of that mindset, focus on the KSAs, you might think about, would more education make up for it? Is there a certificate program? Is there some kind of a program where there was a practical application, where they did like an internship or something like that? Sometimes, sometimes again, you have to get a little bit creative. So, so think about it in terms of, how would they, demonstrate more of those particular KSAs? Again, focusing on the KSAs. And I want to talk about kind of the last thing to talk about is really the preferred qualifications, which I think are really interesting. Preferred qualifications are, as you know, ways to further reduce the applicant pool. Let's say you've got that situation where you've got 200 applicants. You can only interview 20 people, and you've got one opening. So you've got to, and so you do your minimum qualification screen, and then you get down to 100. Now what are you going to do? You've got to do something to further reduce that applicant pool. So you can apply your preferred qualifications. Like if you're requiring an associate's degree, but you would prefer a bachelor's degree, because back when you were talking with your subject matter experts, remember how they said, we really want someone with a bachelor's degree, that would really be best. But then they decided that an associate's was okay for the minimum. Well, you take that information and you say, okay, so bachelor's degree is preferred, right? Or like experience in a customer service position, that's required, but the person might have to, perform in a lead role. So, you would prefer experience in a lead or supervisor position or something like that. So you're familiar with those preferred qualifications. It's important to realize that the minimum qualification screen is not, the preferred qualification screen is not an additional step in the minimum qualification screen. It's typically done there. We do our minimum qualification screen. Now we've got our applicants down to 100. We have to take another pass at it. So we go back through. Now we're applying our preferred qualifications, but we've already decided that those 100 people are minimally qualified. What does that mean? That means that our preferred qualification screen is actually happening over here. We've crossed over the line. We're now into the selection part of the process. Those people are candidates. They are technically candidates. And so we need to be extra careful about our process. And really think about our preferred qualification screen as happening as a first step in the selection process. We've moved on from the minimum qualifications, and now we're doing our preferred qualification screen. And this would be like applying, those additional criteria like, supplemental application questionnaires and things like that. Think about it this way. Think about a continuum of, you've got applicants falling somewhere on a continuum that goes from not at all qualified, wouldn't be able to do the job at all, up to all of the knowledge and skill that you would hope anyone would have so they could walk in and perform the job at a journey level. This would be like the level of expertise that the people who are on the job currently, and they've been there a long time and they're great, that's the level of expertise that they have. And we're probably going to end up hiring people somewhere up here, somewhere up in the high end, up pretty close to that journey level where they'll come in and just with a little bit of orientation, a little bit of training, a little practice doing our procedures, they're going to be up at that journey level. So, but we want to make sure that our applicants have, that we've got enough people to look at, and we're not weeding out people who might be up in that upper end, but we don't really know. So we set our minimum qualifications somewhere on that continuum. We've decided that that's going to be the minimum level. Anyone below that, we're not even going to look at them, because it's a matter of likelihood. What is the likelihood that someone below that level is going to would be successful on the job? And that's, that minimum level is where we've decided that not likely at all. So we set it, the minimum at some point. But what this does is it leaves a gap. We've got this gap between the minimum and those really great people, where there's this whole kind of gray area where it's almost like we're moving that minimally qualified line, but we're not, because minimums are minimums, and those were set there. But we have this area of preferred, we could call that the preferred qualifications area that we have to work with. But remember, because we've already decided who is minimally qualified, they are technically they are candidates now, not applicants. So we need to make sure that when we're developing our preferred qualifications, we develop them in a systematic way that will be able to demonstrate their validity. It's really important to remember that preferred qualifications they're not the nice to haves. And do you know that? Have you heard that? You've probably heard that expression. I hear that a lot. It's like, that's a nice to have. It's not a minimum qualification, but it's nice to have. Well, I hate that expression, because that kind of gets at the hiring processes that were done, well, still today, somewhat, somewhere. I hope not, but decades ago, before the Civil Rights Act, and back, in the 20th century, when hiring was literally managers and heads of companies and whatever saying, we want people who are smart, hardworking, they're going to learn fast, they're going to be easy to get along with, we're going to like them, they're going to be like us. And guess what? They get people that are only like them. They end up hiring people for whatever reason, but something other than their ability to do the job. And of course, that's a big reason why we had the Civil Rights Act and we have Title VII. So that stuff doesn't happen anymore. So when I hear this, it's a nice to have. I don't like that. It's not about being nice. It's about who's going to be able to perform the job. So make sure that your preferred qualifications aren't just those. We would also like someone who, whatever. So keep in mind that your preferred qualification screen is part of the selection process. And so your preferred qualifications have to be based on your job analysis results, whatever those are, whatever review you've done, the same thing that you've used to develop your minimum qualifications, you're going to use for your preferred qualifications. So how do you do that? It's not just, you shouldn't think of your preferred qualifications as just ramping up your minimum qualifications and going up to the next level. An 8A degree, okay, preferred would be bachelor's degree. If we're requiring 3 years experience, let's say we'll prefer 5. That's just arbitrary, and you don't want to do that. And I see that being done. But they need to be based on assessing your KSAs one way or another. So one way to do that is take whatever KSAs were not included in your consideration when you were developing your minimum qualifications. So let's say you picked, like the 5 top, like in that example, that finance example, we had our 5, critical KSAs, and we were focused on making sure that people at least had a minimum level of those. But there could be other things that were not included in that, but are important for performing the job. Maybe even needed upon entry. And so those can be preferred qualifications because you've demonstrated through your job analysis that having those would lead to better job performance because they're needed for the job. Or another way to do this is based on your job analysis. One thing that you do in a typical job analysis is you identify which of your KSAs they're important for performing the job, but not necessarily needed at entry or upon hire, meaning they're generally learned on the job over time. But you can show that, it does lead to better job performance. Therefore, even though it's not required upon entry, if someone had those, they're likely going to be a better performer. And so that could be a preferred qualification as well. Remember, though, that you can't take that if it wasn't determined in your job analysis as being needed upon entry. You can't suddenly use that as a minimum qualification. And that's why you need to think of your preferred qualification screen as part of that selection process, that above and beyond, we've moved on from the minimum qualifications. So just an example, knowledge of business statistics, let's say that was important and it's needed at entry. So you have to demonstrate possession at a minimum level. That becomes one of our minimum qualifications. But then let's say we have another KSA that was knowledge of state financial reporting practices. It was important, so it's needed for performing the job. It leads to better job performance, but it wasn't needed at entry. The idea being that people generally learn this on the job after they've started. But we could use that as a preferred qualification. So then you go back to your process of working with your subject matter experts and asking, how would someone demonstrate knowledge of state financial reporting practices, maybe through experience working in a state, a state agency or something like that. Again, it's all based on your job analysis. And just a couple other points about preferred. They can also be those KSAs that, aren't those critical knowledges or, looking at those, the critical skills or whatever, but other things that would lead to better contextual performance. So contextual performance isn't, what's done on the job so much as how the job is done. Like if you have to work independently with little supervision, or if you have to work as part of a team, like the ability to work cooperatively in a team environment. If that's one of your important or critical KSAs, that would be a great preferred qualification, like experience working in a team environment preferred. Um, maybe someone had worked, independently somewhere, and all their experience is just working by themselves, and that might be okay. So this isn't necessarily a minimum qualification, but if you could show through your job analysis that having that ability would lead to better job performance, that's a great preferred qualification. But remember, you have to be able to demonstrate the job relatedness, um, and that the experience is um, demonstrating possession of the important KSAs. Again, don't focus on the job itself. Don't look at those job tasks. I also see that done. People will look at, not the critical tasks, but maybe the marginal tasks, the ones that aren't performed quite as often, and say, it would be nice if people had experience doing those too. But remember the problems with focusing too much on the job tasks. So again, focusing on the KSAs and what would demonstrate possession of those. So that was the last point that I wanted to make. So I just a couple points to sum it up. You should really think about your minimum qualification screen as a test, because it technically is a test for all, employment testing purposes, and based on our requirements and best practice and all of that. It is part of the selection process. It is one of your selection tools, meaning that the development of your minimum qualifications has to be job related. It has to be valid. You have to be able to demonstrate the content validity of it. And so you should make developing and or at least reviewing your minimum qualifications, make that part of your selection development, part of that your whole program of developing whatever it is you're going to do to select those, your final candidates. If you can at all, don't just use existing minimum qualifications without reviewing them based on current job analysis results. Now, again, I'm not talking about, licensures and certifications and things that are required by law. No point in reviewing those. You have to require those. I know that some of you probably have rules about you have to apply the minimum qualifications that are in the job description or in the class specification, and they can't be changed. I would say try to fight that as much as you can, especially if it doesn't look like they match up with your job analysis results. If at all possible, don't just use those existing ones. Don't just pull them off of the job description. But actually work on developing them in a systematic way, just like you would any other selection tool. And so when you're developing your minimum qualifications, focus on the KSAs needed for the job and not the job itself. Remember, don't just look at the job and say, well, because of the level of the job, it looks like we would probably need this kind of degree or whatever. But what is the appropriate type and amount of education experience for this particular job? So focusing on the job, what is appropriate, trying to match it up, but rather think about your KSAs. What education and experience would demonstrate possession of those KSAs at the level needed for minimally acceptable performance? And again, you might end up at the same place. You might end up with the same education, the same experience, but just through your approach, being able to say that you reviewed the KSAs, you determined that that was how someone could demonstrate those KSAs at a minimum level, you have demonstrated validity. Your minimum qualifications are now valid and they are defensible. And you've ensured that they're going to be fair because you're only looking for something that you've demonstrated that is absolutely job related. And also remember, get creative in this. There are lots of different ways that people can demonstrate possession of the KSA. So don't just assume it's certain education or certain experience, but think of all kinds of different ways and use your subject matter experts to help you with this. All kinds of different ways that people could demonstrate those KSAs. Remember, you want to make sure you let enough people through where they could do the job, even if they don't look on paper like they could necessarily, at least based on your established minimum qualifications. Keep in mind, too, that more is not necessarily better, education or experience. There is a right amount for that minimum level. And there's a point of diminishing returns, as you probably know, after a certain number of, especially with experience, after a certain number of years on the job, people aren't necessarily better at their job or would be better at a new job if they were to transfer or something like that. Important to remember too that preferred qualifications aren't the nice to haves. It's just not nice to have. We're not like, also we're looking for these KSAs, but also we want people who are friendly and are going to show up on time and whatever. Got to be job related. We're going to go back to our job analysis and look for those other KSAs, maybe ones that weren't built into the minimum qualifications, or ones that are important but not necessarily needed upon entry or hire, and those can be preferred qualifications. And finally, make sure that you use subject matter experts in all of this. In all of this that I'm talking about, you've got to use subject matter experts because you're really going to rely on their expert judgment of what it would take to demonstrate those KSAs. They're going to know more about different types of experience and education and what it takes to do the job, and how you would know from someone's background if they're likely to be qualified at a minimum level. So again, always use subject matter experts in everything you do. So, and that is my final point. I think we're just about out of time. So I'm going to stop right there. I don't know if we have, Alan, if we have a little bit of time for questions, maybe. If
Yeah,
not,
just a couple
okay.
that came up. So
Okay.
a lot of people wanted to know if you were going to make the deck available. So that was something that was asked.
Yes.
Okay, if you can
And
post that in the chat, that'd be great.
Okay.
And that way they can access the deck. And the other question was for managing in a resource constrained scenario. Are generally accepted benchmarks like DOLO net valid tools for identifying KSAs?
I'm sorry, what tools?
So like DOLO or net valid tools for identifying KSA, like I guess it's DOL.
Yeah, yeah, looking at other sources, going to like ONET, is a big one, or looking at other agencies to look at their requirements. Yeah, and that's anything that you can do to try to identify those critical KSAs, even if you are extremely resource constrained. And I get that a job analysis can be a large process and take a lot of resources. If you can't, whatever you can do to try to identify those KSAs for the job is certainly better than not doing anything else. And if your job matches something at DOL or in listed in any of their materials, like going to ONET, or if your job really matches a similar job at another agency, you have indication that it's pretty much the same job. Yeah, I mean, you can definitely use those KSAs. It's not as good. You don't have that, what we call local validation, which is making sure that a process is valid specifically for your agency or whatever, but it's certainly much better, and I highly recommend doing that rather than just making those assumptions, or you just using the pre-existing minimum qualifications.
Yeah, and we have another person that wants to come off mute and ask you a question. Is that okay?
Yes.
Hey, go ahead, Amy.
Thank you. I appreciate the presentation, Jeff, and I agree with everything you said, all your points. I guess the one place where I might push back a little, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on this, is in in the many years I've been doing this, I mean, I find that subject matter experts, there's no substitute really for working with them. But I also find that they're not really that helpful in helping determine MQs. A lot of times they make exactly the kinds of assumptions that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so I kind of feel like, it's my job as a trained professional to sort of take in the information that they've provided and consider the factors that you've talked about, and then set some kind of reasonable minimum qualifications, and of course ask for them to review it,
Yeah.
and see if does that make sense, does it seem too low, does it seem too high, is it going to unnecessarily bar people from competing for the job.
Yeah.
do they have good performers who work for them who maybe, didn't have that kind of experience or education coming in? All those questions.
Yeah.
Because relying on them too heavily, I just feel like I don't feel like I'd get the results that I needed.
I think that's a great point, and you're absolutely right. And that is that's common with working with subject matter experts kind of in every area. They tend to have an agenda, especially if they're the hiring managers and you're saying, what's the absolute minimum? They're thinking about what they want. They're going to say, well, I want 5 years experience and I want a bachelor's degree or whatever. And that we're looking at just the absolute minimums. So I think your approach is great. You're using them, you're getting their expertise, you're getting their ideas, and then you're adding in your own your like reality, HR expertise and the real world. And I think that's a great point. And I wouldn't just take what they say as absolute, like it has to be this. Use your HR expertise and make it all reasonable, because I've experienced that too with subject matter experts that they can be not terribly helpful. Sometimes they are. They can give you lots of good information about what is equivalent or how other ways that people could get the experience, but I wouldn't. Yeah, I think you're right in not taking what they say as sort of the final answer. Incorporate that into your process. I think you're
Thank you.
absolutely right. Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate your comments.
Yeah.
All righty. Just want to say thank you to everybody attending. Appreciate you guys being here. We do have a post-webinar survey we would like you to fill out. This is really valuable for our presenters. We'd love to get that feedback. And we will be making the recording available later on. So you can always check the link that I posted if you want to review the recording or share that recording. And if you want more information, I posted a link to our test rental section of our website, in that it's a lot more information about this process. Thanks, Jeff, for the presentation.
Yeah.
And we're going to go ahead and start. We're going to shut the recording down.
Oh, okay. And and I wanted to say too, I know that a couple of you posted some questions in the chat, and I appreciate that. I didn't get a chance to address those. My this slide has my my email address on there. Feel free to email me with questions that you have or any kind of follow-up comments if you want. We can like talk offline about that if you want. I certainly would be more than happy to do that. And then as far as the deck, I don't know, Alan, is there a way we can
Yeah, you
post
can
it?
yeah, you can post it on the chat. If you can post that in the chat, that'd be great, because they'll
Okay.
still have access to get back to the chat and download it.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Would I
Okay.
have to let's see, would they have a certain amount of time to get into it? I'm just trying to.
I think it would be, or we could get a list of participants and send them the deck.
Okay, that might work better rather than me
Okay.
trying to fumble with it right now. We can do
Okay.
that, right? We can
Okay.
just kind of send it out.
Yep, no, we can do that.
Okay.
All right.
That sounds good.
All right. Well, I'm gonna stop the recording now.